Okay. Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. This is our panel titled Beyond Capitalism versus Socialism, Debating Planning, Markets, and Prices in the Early Soviet Union, Post-War USA, and Reform Era China. A shorter and possibly more intuitive title might have been Markets under Socialism and Planning under Capitalism. I'm thrilled to be able to host three PhD students today for this panel who all haven't attended a History of Economics Thought conference before, as far as I'm aware. So it's great to introduce you all to this community. Two from the history discipline and one from economics. So we start right away with Evan's presentation. Evan is a PhD student in economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Evan, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks. Just going to share my screen. Okay, everyone can see my screen? Great. My name is Evan Wassner. I'm a PhD student at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And what I'm presenting on is from a paper I wrote for a History of Thought course, actually taught by Isabella. But quite frankly, as it currently stands, I'm not exactly contributing much new, but I'm looking for directions to take my research. And nonetheless, I think the presentation will be useful as a starting point for a comparative analysis between experiences of market reforms between the Soviet Union and China, which Isabella and I have discussed doing. I'm also really only just beginning my research, still figuring out directions for my dissertation. So any feedback, suggestions, or ideas on where this type of inquiry can take me would be much appreciated. So the contradiction between the aspirations of replacing market forces with economic planning and the return to market forces and the quest for economic development continuously surfaced throughout the experience of 20th century socialism. As the first socialist movement to come to power and attempt to implement a revolutionary Marxist program, the Soviet experience in particular and the legacy of the new economic policy have been referenced by, if not directly influenced, a number of reform movements throughout the socialist world which have grappled with similar questions. For example, Soviet reformers in the 1960s and the 1980s referred back to the new economic policy. Eastern European market reformers and market reformers in 1980s China also at least referenced the new economic policy. And I think the question of China particularly looms large given recent developments. Branko Milanovic, for example, recently raised the question of whether China's post-1978 period of reforms may be interpreted as one long NEP, foreshadowing a possible return to economic planning or some other remnant of the Maoist period as the Soviet Union did towards the end of the 1920s. Therefore, a careful review of the Bolsheviks' own interpretation of the NEP as pioneers of market reforms under socialism may help to provide a foundation on which to understand the repeated attempts at reform experienced throughout the history of 20th century socialism and the continuing trajectory of the remaining socialist states. And one can certainly find accounts and interpretations of the Bolsheviks' writings on the NEP. Alexander Ehrlich's The Soviet Industrialization Debate is a comprehensive account of the debates that took place within the Communist Party during the NEP period. The debate has also received some attention from economists over the decades for its groundbreaking and influential analysis on industrialization and economic development. For example, Joseph Stiglitz and Raj Shah have devoted a chapter to the Soviet industrialization debate in a textbook on economic development, and you can find other pieces in the economic development literature which examine this debate. But rather than focusing on questions of industrialization and economic development, I'm more interested in the ideological justifications of why revolutionary Marxists continue to return to the market when, at least initially, they desire to replace the anarchy of markets and capitalist production with, as Engels put it, the social regulation of production upon a definite plan according to the needs of the community and of each individual. Therefore, I examine the Bolsheviks' own justifications in their own words for the use of markets and capitalist social relations and the quest to build socialism and economic planning, two terms which nearly all participants in the Soviet industrialization debate viewed as synonymous. And for now, I mainly, especially for this presentation, I'm just going to focus on the works of Lenin as well as Bukharin. And for now, I read in English, but I'm working hard on my Russian. So texts I use are, say, the collected works of Lenin in English and various translations of different texts of Bukharin. So how did the Bolsheviks justify the rapid change from the policies of war communism, whereby much of the economy was nationalized and put under the centralized control of the Bolsheviks, to the re-implementation of markets and capitalist social relations under the NEP, when the policies of centralization under war communism clearly aligned with their long-term interests of organizing the economy as one giant factory? Starting with Lenin, overall for Lenin, the NEP was viewed as necessary only due to the specific historical conditions the Russian Revolution found itself in. Lenin had three main justifications for re-implementing markets and capital social relations. The first had to do with relations between the peasantry and the proletarian state, the second with economic recovery from years of destruction, and the third to build the necessary preconditions that the Russian economy would need before fully planning the national economy was even possible. So looking at the first point in greater detail. Contrary to the predictions of Marx and Engels, the first successful workers' revolution took place in so-called undeveloped, backwards country, with the working class comprising only a small minority of the population. In 1917, over 80% of the Russian population resided in the countryside and depended on small-scale, often subsistence farming. And according to Lenin, as opposed to wage laborers whose immediate economic interests lay in the socialization of production and economic planning, the direct interests of petty agricultural commodity producers lay in personal accumulation based on free market exchange. In other words, petty commodity producers do not have an economic interest in socialism, whereas wage laborers do. Therefore, Lenin argued that only a developed class of agricultural wage laborers can socially, economically, and politically support a direct transition to socialism, whereas in a country where the overwhelming majority, in a country where the overwhelming majority of the population consists of small agricultural producers, a socialist revolution can be carried out only through the implementation of a whole series of special transitional measures, which would be superfluous in a highly developed capitalist country where wage workers in industry and agriculture make up the vast majority. So it was out of, of course, every subsequent socialist revolution has taken place under extremely different circumstances, but I think this quote from Lenin in 1921 is quite relevant when thinking about the history of 20th century socialism. So it was out of the threat of peasant revolt, specifically after the Kronstadt uprising in early 1921, that Lenin called for the policy of state acquisition of peasant surpluses to be replaced by a fixed tax in kind, thereby giving the peasantry sovereignty to exchange their surplus produce on the market, which was prohibited under war communism. So therefore, due to the class interests of petty commodity producing peasantry, the re-implementation of markets and private production for agricultural produce was an urgent necessity in order for the proletarian state to maintain power. Now, Lenin also hoped that through state policy of favoring large-scale collective farms and due to increased efficiency via the adaptation of new technology and increasing returns to scale, market competition would actually facilitate the gradual voluntary transition to the peasant economy into collectivized production, which Lenin argued would transform the agricultural producers' interests into those of socialism. This idea that market forces would inevitably lead to the proliferation of large-scale production via the tendency of the concentration and centralization of capital is, I think, a problematic one, but another idea that has shown itself in the history of the ideas of market reformers under socialism. But today, we know that this process of gradual and voluntary collectivization in the agricultural sector did not happen as fast as the Bolsheviks, or at least in particular Stalin, would have liked by the end of the 1920s. Moving on to the Lenin's second main line of argument. In a speech in 1921, Lenin declared, "Our principal productive forces, the peasants and workers, are in such a state of impoverishment, ruin, weariness, and exhaustion that for a time we must subordinate everything to this main consideration, increasing the quantity of products at all costs." And this concept of subordinating everything to the tasks of increasing the quantity of products at all costs is another quote that I think looms over the history of 20th century socialism. While Lenin in this quote is referring to recovering from the destruction of the Civil War and World War I, the general idea of the need for undeveloped socialist nations to catch up to the advanced capitalist nations has been a major theme in the justification for the use of markets. Now, of course, the Bolsheviks had placed their hopes for a successful transition to socialism in Russia on socialist revolutions in the more advanced capitalist nations, which would have been able to provide the Soviet Union with advanced machinery and aid in the development of large-scale production. But by 1921, it was clear that the Bolsheviks had to abandon any notion of relying on this possibility. Therefore, Lenin concluded, that Russia could not recover from the economic devastation without the help of capital by providing foreign capital with proper conditions of profitability. And in order to do so, the state would engage in direct trade with capitalist nations, lease out state-owned factories to foreign capitalists to be run on a capitalist basis, which were known as concessions, and denationalize small-scale industrial production. Today, of course, we're more familiar with terms like foreign direct investment. But the idea was that provide conditions for capitalist profitability in order to import the advanced means of production from the advanced capitalist world. But Lenin asks, what is to be the effect of all of this? He says, it is the revival of the petty bourgeoisie and of capitalism. That much is certain, and it is ridiculous to shut our eyes to it. Lenin does not shy away from the reality that the NEP was reinstituting capitalist social relations. This contrasts sharply with, for example, Chinese reformers in the 1980s who seek to reconcile markets and private production with socialism, i.e. declaring a socialist market economy. Lenin instead is very explicit in asserting that the NEP is not socialism, but a transition to socialism, which itself, of course, is a transition to communism. In fact, Lenin famously calls for the implementation of state capitalism, which he defines as a situation where the state brings under its direct control certain capitalist enterprises. Now, as far back as 1918, just when the Bolsheviks were implementing the policies of war communism itself, Lenin right then was arguing that the development of state capitalism would be a step forward for socialism in Russia. And why? Here's the third main justification for the use of competitive markets and capitalist social relations, and I think one that is sometimes overlooked. In order to implement economic planning, the state would need the capacity to collect information, maintain constant communication with all units of production, and effect control over productive units. The need to develop the informational capacity to run a planned economy, and perhaps its supposed impossibility, is developed in more detail later throughout the socialist calculation debate. But in attempting to actually implement planning, the Bolsheviks on their own had recognized this problem. Thus, Lenin argued that the development of state capitalism would in fact build the material conditions which he considered prerequisites for a state's ability to enact economic planning. Those conditions being the development of public bookkeeping, comprehensive accounting, and direct control over production, three terms which appear in nearly all of his writings and speeches from 1917 until his death. So in sum, Lenin argued that the return of markets and capitalist social relations were necessary in order to stabilize and solidify the class alliance between the peasantry and the proletarian state, rehabilitate and rapidly develop the forces of production, and build the economic preconditions necessary for economic planning itself. And these were seen as temporary transitional measures only necessary to the specific historical conditions of 1917 Russia, measures which would be superfluous in an advanced capitalist nation. So I'm pretty much out of time, so I'll touch a little bit more on Bukharin when I comment on Isabella's paper. But anyway, I'll end here and just say that there are many connections to be made to other reform movements throughout the history of 20th century socialism, and perhaps even with wartime and post-war economies in the capitalist world. And so that kind of comparative analysis is one direction I'm hoping to take my research. And in my comments on Isabella's paper, I'll make some connections between my presentation and the experience in China. And another question I think remains to be investigated in more detail is how the actual experience of war communism and the NEP transformed conceptions of socialism and economic planning in a broader context. And I hope from the remaining presentations, we can make some connections in possible areas to compare and contrast. So thanks.
Terrific, thanks, Evan. I'll jump right in as the commentator on this paper. Evan in this paper revisits the 1920s Soviet debate around a new political economy. Most accounts in Anglo-Saxon economics of this debate follow Ehrlich's focus on the question of industrialization. Most prominently, it is considered as a great industrialization debate that bears lessons for development economics. In contrast, in the context of the experience of socialism in the 20th century, the new political economy debate is both about the needs to develop the forces of production to overcome economic backwardness that undermines the material and class foundation of socialism, as well as about the question of what forms of economic organization can serve a communist revolution. As such, it is an account of the compatibility of socialism, profits, and capitalist management and techniques that rivals the socialist calculation debate of the interwar period. But while the socialist calculation debate has induced some of the most has involved some of the most prominent economists in Europe and the United States, the most important protagonists of the Soviet debate are communist leaders, Lenin, Bukharin, and Preobrazhensky, above all. On the surface, the two debates are both about markets and socialism, and some have, as Evan shows, interpreted the new political economy debate as a precursor to market socialism. However, the two debates address substantially different questions, and the socialists involved come to vastly different conclusions. The socialist calculation debate has been famously started by Ludwig von Mises. He raised the question that set the terms of the debate. Mises asks whether a rational socialist economy was at all possible. He defines a socialist economy as a centrally planned economy with public ownership and argues it was impossible to determine the values of goods in such an economy, since this economy was deprived of any standards of value, which would make any kind of economic calculation, and in fact, any kind of rational organization, impossible. The socialist side in the socialist calculation debate, most famously, of course, Oskar Lange, then argues that socialists could, in fact, use mechanisms that are akin to the market in order to solve the calculation problem, thus arguing for market socialism. In contrast, as Evan reminds us, in the debate over the new political economy, socialism continued to be defined in terms of an economy that is organized through central planning and public ownership. So in this context, then, the use of markets is not about the creation of some sort of ideal type market socialism, where markets can solve the abstract problem of resource allocation. Rather, markets and capitalist dynamics are used as a weapon in the revolutionary struggle, and state capitalism as a transitionary state towards the achievement of socialism that in itself can only be a tool in the pursuit of actual socialism. As such, the level of analysis is vastly different. In the case of the socialist calculation debate, the question is one of ideal type and the theoretical possibility of certain forms of organizations. In the context of the new political economy, the level of analysis is one of practical questions of how to actually achieve socialism. Thank you very much. Let's move on then to Tim Barker. Tim is a PhD student in the history department at Harvard, working on the economics of military spending in the United States and about to finish his PhD. Tim, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Isabella. Just sharing my screen. I'll start that. Okay, so I'm going to talk today about the other side of the Iron Curtain and about the Cold War political economy in the United States. And I thought I'd begin by tying this to some contemporary debates about inflation, which everyone here knows has been a topic of great interest in the last year or two. And one of the outstanding features of the new discourse about inflation is a growing recognition that inflation is not just a matter of excess demand in general or of too much money, but it's often a result of the specific composition of demand. What is it that's being demanded? And I think this recognition that it was the composition and not just the volume of demand that mattered for inflation was quite common knowledge at one time in the US in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And my talk today is going to focus on a specific version of that idea, which was focused on the capital goods sector in the economy. And so in addition to recovering this perspective from the 50s and 60s, I'm also going to suggest that it can only be understood in the political economic context of the Cold War, which in the United States saw not just higher levels of military spending, but also an increased attention to raising the share of investment in GDP as a matter of public policy. But to start, we have to go before the Cold War and go back to some of the ideas associated with the New Deal and the Fair Deal. And a lot of people in these circles imagined that the future was going to be what they called a high consumption economy, one in which the share of personal consumption and sometimes also what they would call collective consumption in the form of public goods would be higher than it had been in the past. And you can see this idea in the work of Alvin Hansen, who was the sort of outstanding American macroeconomist and a popularizer of Keynesian ideas. And this is a quote here from 1940, but the same idea could still be heard as late as early 1950 in the reports of the Council of Economic Advisors. The CEA had been formed as a result of the 1946 Employment Act. And so this was sort of their first, this was the first Council of Economic Advisors. And the dominant figure here was Leon Keyserling, who became acting head of the CEA in late 1949 and would become the official head of the CEA in the middle of 1950. And so this is a quote here from their report from 1950, which came out early in the year, that is before the Korean War started, where they're looking forward to a future where consumption is growing faster than business investment. And this is a table from that same report in which you can see in the first line that consumption as a share of the national income was already falling compared to its earlier levels. And this was a matter of concern already to the Council of Economic Advisors, who thought that this should be going up instead of going down. But at the very same time that they were writing this report, another vision of the future of the economy was being generated in the circles of Cold War policy planners in the State Department. And this vision was articulated in the famous State Department planning document, NSC 68, which is a sort of blueprint for US Cold War strategy, which was presented to Truman in April 1950. And it's often remembered by people who study the Cold War that NSC 68 made the case for a big rearmament and a big increase in US military spending. What's less frequently remembered, I think, is that it also made a specific argument for raising the share of investment in US GDP as a result of these comparisons in the tables you see here with the Soviet Union, which they showed devoted much more of its national income to investment and less to consumption. And so here we see an example of the US or policymakers in the US responding to the planned economy of the Soviet Union by undertaking their own kind of planning. And NSC 68 made, what could essentially be called a proposal for a 5-year plan to raise both the share of defense in US national income and the share of investment. And if we look at what happened, we can see that it was the NSC 68 vision of the future rather than the Council of Economic Advisors vision of the future that ended up winning out. And so we see here, there was a big increase in the defense share of gross domestic product. Over the course of the Cold War also, the share of investment tended to rise in the economy. Whereas despite, I think the fabled prosperity of these years and the way historians tend to think about them as years of, a consumer economy, the share of consumption in the economy actually fell and remained depressed below its pre-Cold War level, basically through the end of the Cold War. And so you see this line here really traces the exact length of the Cold War coming to an end kind of perfectly in the early 1990s. And so this vision that the Council of Economic Advisors had of raising the share of consumption obviously didn't happen. Okay, so that's the kind of lineaments of a specific Cold War political economy defined by the components of demand, right? And I'm going to suggest in the rest of the talk that this specific composition of demand gave rise to specific kinds of dilemmas, which we can see at crucial moments in the Cold War political economy. The first moment is the late 1950s, when for the first time since there was a brief Korean War inflation, which was managed by relatively comprehensive government controls, but then inflation started to return in the late 1950s. And I start here with a quote from Randolph Burgess, who was at the time an undersecretary of the Treasury, but he was also a banker associated with the National City Bank of New York, which became Citibank. He also served at different times as the US ambassador to NATO. So he's a sort of, perfect Cold War figure. And here he gives a version of that idea I referred to earlier, which is that there are many different kinds of inflation. And he says that, in the 1920s, there was a commodity inflation. In 1929, a security, by which he means, stocks and bonds inflation. And the current inflation in the late 1950s is a capital goods inflation compounded by what he calls the enormous armament expenditure in this country. And he makes this really interesting point that the armament program uses a lot of the same specific resources that are used to produce investment goods. So when you have a high level of private investment and a large armaments program, you put a lot of pressure on the same sectors of the economy. And if we had more time, we could go into some of the specific linkages here, but they're quite striking if you look at sectors like in 1958, according to the input-output tables prepared by the US government, 39% of machine shop products were accounted for directly or indirectly by government defense demand. So we're talking about some very strong linkages there between the sector of the economy producing investment goods and defense production. And so Burgess's idea, which I think became increasingly common, was that there's something specific about the interaction between the high private investment and the high military spending that caused this specific kind of inflation. And here we can see the arrow there showing you the moment he was speaking at, which is the sort of crest of the mid-1950s boom. And you can see that indeed there was a rising level of both private fixed investment and defense spending. So we can sort of see what he's talking about there. This idea that Burgess had became increasingly widespread and actually was introduced into official government channels as a result of these studies carried out under the auspices of the Joint Economic Committee of the US Congress. And there were a number of study papers they produced as part of a broader study of employment growth and price levels in 1959 and 1960. And you see here the titles of some of the ones that are especially relevant to the problem of Cold War political economy and capital goods inflation. And probably the most famous of these was the study paper number 1, produced by Charles Schulz, who would later become director of the budget under Lyndon Johnson and then head of the CEA under Carter. And Schulz outlined in this paper what became a pretty influential case for a specific sectoral basis for the late 1950s inflation, which he traced, as you might expect, to the capital goods industries. He said there was not an excess of consumer demand, despite high levels of consumer demand in 1955. After that, between 55 and 57, we actually saw declining sales in automobiles and houses and the other consumer industries that had driven the initial part of the boom. Instead, he said very specifically the growth and the rises in prices could be concentrated in the capital goods industries. And according to Schulz's calculations, capital goods and allied industries accounted for 2/3 of the rise in industrial prices during the period. Prices in those industries rose 15%, compared with an average increase of just 4% in all other industries. And Schulz also called attention to another significant, new feature of the inflation, which was that it seemed to coincide with recession. And so in this graph, you can see that in the earlier post-war recessions, prices had fallen in the 1949 recession. In the 1953-54 recession, they maybe rose a little bit, but remained mostly level. But you see that the 1957-58 recession, which was steeper than the earlier post-war recessions, was associated with a continued rise in prices. And this is clearly recognizable as a kind of proto-stagflation. People didn't use that word at the time. It was coined in the UK context in the mid-1960s, but they used plenty of similar expressions in the late 50s. Schulz himself called it recession cum inflation, but was clearly talking about the fact that prices could continue to rise alongside mounting excess capacity. And here too, Schulz turned to the specific sectoral basis of the inflation, the capital goods sector, to explain what was happening here. And he said that because the capital goods sector is an input into all other sectors which engage in any kind of investment, price rises that begun there could then spread with a lag throughout the entire economy, even as the recession generally set in. And there's a further point, which is that the result of an investment boom in the short term might be rising prices. In the longer term, an investment boom will also increase capacity. And so the same phenomenon, the investment boom, which led to these rising prices, also led to increased capacity, which would mean that there was excess capacity unless final demand could keep up. And so you saw in this period a brief return of controversy around the idea of composition of demand and some new advocates making the case that Hansen had once made, that investment demand should actually now shrink as a part of GDP and be replaced by growing consumer demand. But that didn't happen. We see here in the first part of the 60s expansion, capacity utilization in manufacturing remained low compared to the peak levels of the 1950s, showing that final demand had not grown in line with the growth of the productive capacity economy. And we see further that personal consumption expenditures continued actually to fall as a share of GDP in the early 1960s. And so what this means is that the rest of the 1960s boom, like the 1950s boom, also turned out to depend on defense and investment spending. And we can see here that the levels of investment, which had appeared as sort of unsustainable boom levels in the mid-1950s, turned out to actually just be a baseline for the growth of investment in the 1960s, which then sort of grew on top of that baseline to achieve even a higher share of GDP and to be sustained for even more years. And so, as you might predict, based on the line of my argument, it's not surprising that the Vietnam boom of the mid-1960s, which was based on a growth of fixed investment and also of national defense spending, shown here in this graph, saw the revival of similar inflationary pressures to those that appeared in the mid to late 1950s. And contemporaries were very quick to link these two developments. This screenshot here is from a paper written by one of Charles Schultz's students. And he went through the sectoral data and showed that the pressures in the mid-1960s inflation, which is the beginning of what we think of as the Great Inflation, were very similar to those in the mid to late 1950s, and similarly based in the capital goods industries. You might think one difference between the Vietnam boom and the late 50s moment is the absence of a recession. There was a sharp recession in 1958, and as we know, the 1960s expansion continued through the end of the decade, through late 1969. But there actually was, as you can see here, a real slowdown in economic growth, which almost became a recession in early 1967, and contemporaries refer to this as a growth recession or a mini recession. And so I think it's interesting that you actually find people in this moment speaking as if it were another proto-stagflationary moment, which I think indeed it was. The Vietnam War was the only thing at this point keeping the economy moving forward. And so a lot of people did experience this as a recession in the civilian economy. And we have a few quotes here to establish that. The first is Arthur Burns, who had been a member of the Eisenhower CEA and became head of the Federal Reserve under Richard Nixon shortly thereafter, reminding people that recession and inflation can go together. And then a few months later, we have Bill Brock, a Republican congressman from Tennessee, making the same point, that you can have inflation and recession at the same time, particularly under a wartime situation as we have in Vietnam. And this is significant historically because I think it's often suggested that the stagflation of the 1970s was somehow inconceivable before it happened, and that the existing paradigms just didn't allow for it. But I think we see here that even at a moment when the economy was apparently growing, there was a sharp awareness that this stuff was not only possible, but in fact had been part of the US experience. I'll wrap up shortly, but here we just have some more examples of this widespread awareness of the sort of specific role of the composition of demand in investment and the fact that investment was fueling inflation. And in the other thing from the Boston Globe, we see proposals to shift the stress from defense and capital goods to consumption as a way of addressing these things. I don't have time today to talk about the 1970s, which is the decade, obviously, where the real action is here. But I want to just end with a few suggestions about how that decade's stagflation relate to these dynamics I've referred to here. And so here we see some economic statistics from the mid-1970s recession, which was really the central stagflationary moment, right? The one where the deepest recession was associated with rising prices. And it's really at the core of what people mean when they talk about the 70s stagflation. And what you see here is capacity utilization in iron and steel products compared to general levels of capacity utilization, both in manufacturing and across the economy. And what's really interesting here is that you see that utilization in steel remains really high well into the recession. And this was a result, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, of strong demand coming from the capital equipment sector. So I would suggest that even though there's a lot of complicated things going on with the mid-1970s recession, which defy any simple reduction to this one sector explanation. I think the idea that specific demands on the capital goods sector and a specific kind of cyclicality in which the capital goods sector continued to operate at high levels into the recession helps us demystify this sort of otherwise baffling phenomenon in which prices continue to rise even as unemployment and excess capacity appeared in the rest of the economy. And I'll leave it there for now.
Thanks, Tim. We now have comments by Andrew Alred. Andrew is just finished his PhD in history at UC Santa Barbara, working on the economics of planning before the Volcker shock. He's now in the research department of a public sector union in California, I believe. Andrew, the floor is yours.
Sure, I'll keep my remarks on Tim's paper relatively short, include some questions at the end that hopefully we can talk about, but my paper, which I'll read after that, covers some of the same ground, and hopefully I won't have to, hopefully you'll see the comparison. So Tim Barker offers a provocative reinterpretation of American capitalism in its moments of apparent weakness during the recessions of the late 50s and the 1970s, as instead an overbuilt society suffering from an excess of private investment. Now, for 15 years before the Korean War, such price investment relationships have been heavily politicized in the public, with investment decisions and break-even points of large manufacturers debated by journalists and politicians. Tim shows the dilemmas that followed from that period when demand for capital goods drove price increases in the sector that dispersed throughout the economy. Now, you can see why this is provocative, because he's arguing that private investment exacerbated the dysfunctional operation of the US economy during these periods of proto-stagflation, as he calls it, when overbuilding productive capacity, depressed capacity utilization, bred unemployment, and pushed up prices. Now, this depiction is clear on its own, but it does raise certain questions about our interpretation of the 20th century, and particularly, American capitalism during the 20th century. And one of these is, how much is new here about growth and inflation? You're reminding us that the periods of rising prices in the 1970s, beginning with the Vietnam War, was accompanied by and even pushed by an expansion of private investment. And yet, for the past 20 years, one of the main devices for trying to stabilize the price level has been to decrease private investment. And so apparently this is a relationship that we know already. Now your explanation of the stag part of stagflation is of course something new there, but so there's a general question about growth and inflation. Why is it that sometimes some people associate inflation with stagnation instead of growth? And then a second question is, if there was this view from the Joint Economic Committee in the late 50s and, the early Kennedy administration, and even as the Vietnam War began, this diagnosis of the source of inflation being a capital goods inflation and an excess of private investment, why did the US government remain committed to stimulating employment through the further stimulation of private investment? If the diagnosis was there, why wasn't there a shift towards raising the consumption share and increasing employment that way? So those are two general questions. And then one final suggestion, you had a graph on there that showed the private investment share of GDP for the 20th century, and it looked exactly like graphs of the CPI for the 20th century. And I thought that was just a very clear, if you could compare those, just not everyone is familiar with the shape of the CPI graph, but it looked exactly the same. Okay, those are my comments.
Thanks, Andrew. Would you like to follow up with your paper right away?
Yes. So I have a paper here that is, I'd like to talk today, I guess, about the stabilization politics of macroeconomic guidance before central bank supremacy, as we might think about it today. And so I have a paper here on indicative planning and wage restraint. During the Cold War, when the prospect of Soviet economic growth became a matter of national security in the North Atlantic, the advanced capitalist countries managed their economies by reference to what the French called indicative planning. This referred to a national macroeconomic strategy in which the central government, after surveying private investment plans and determining the national budget position, published a regular forecast of national growth, including projections by industry, indicating how private and public plans could converge. The one variable most difficult to control in this growth program was wages. Historians often describe the 1950s and the 1960s in the North Atlantic and in Japan as the heyday of political consensus over the terms of the indirect management of the economy. Historians and social scientists write of a, quote, implicit agreement between employers and unions, end quote. They refer to Keynesianism as a, quote, political construct, end quote. And they write of, quote, consensual wage determination, end quote, in which wage rates are determined as part of a broader consideration of social priorities by government and employers that include investment, growth, employment, environmental protection, etc. As economic historians recognize, in Western Europe and Japan, the period of growth that followed the Korean War was founded on restraining the increase in the price of labor. Yet little attention has been given to the project of wage restraint in the United States, or the reasons for its collapse during the later 1960s and the 1970s. Why did wage restraint, the foundation of the social democratic political economy across the North Atlantic, fail? How was the global neoliberal period that followed shaped by that failure? For the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, the disjuncture between planned growth and reality during the 1960s arose in two phases. First was the problem of corporate pricing. As the Kennedy administration quickly learned, the largest manufacturers were entirely willing to publicly challenge administration guidelines and test the government's commitment to private corporate autonomy. Once the Vietnam War began, this program of pricing restraint was unable to maintain price stability in the metals, heavy manufacturing, and construction sectors. This created the second problem, which was a rising cost of living. Unable to apply guidelines to unit profits to stabilize factor shares as production met capacity, prices and the cost of living began to rise. Unable to control prices, as the Truman and Roosevelt administrations had done in prior wars in East Asia, the onus of responsibility in stabilization planning during the Johnson administration fell to wage restraint and to those in contact with organized labor. Having allowed producers to diverge from the plan, during the later Johnson and Nixon years, economic advisors came to see the maintenance of stability as resting squarely on the shoulders of organized workers, those who were capable of defending their real income against a rising price level. This, I argue, is when tight labor markets became a vice rather than a virtue in the world of North Atlantic capitalism. So what were the guideposts? The heart of the microeconomic policy in the United States were the high productivity firms, those that enjoyed increasing returns to scale, whose unit costs fell as production expanded. And this was usually possible because there was tremendous excess capacity in the American economy. The Kennedy program paired fiscal expansion with government guidelines for private wage and price decisions to ensure that domestic costs did not rise in excess of productivity. Kennedy advisor Walt Rostow had written for the 1960 campaign staff that the nation would have to devise new institutions to overcome its, quote, inflation problem, end quote. According to Rostow, the, quote, heart of the problem was that as a society, we have no agreed norm for wage and price policy, end quote. This thesis was widely perceived. In a pre-inauguration memo to the president-elect, Paul Samuelson, Kennedy's initial choice for the CEA chairman, explained that, quote, just as we pioneered in the 1920s in creating potent monetary mechanisms and in the 1930s in forging the tools of effective fiscal policy, so may it be necessary in the 1960s to meet head-on the problem of a price creep, end quote. And as Kennedy confidant and historian Arthur Schlesinger later remembered, quote, in essential ways, the wage price spiral was beyond the reach of fiscal and monetary policy. revealing how new institutions assuring a greater public role in wage price settlements might be a desirable later step, end quote. That's Schlesinger's description of the early Kennedy years, the problem of the early Kennedy years. So in its first economic report submitted to the Congress in January of 1962, the Kennedy CEA included a description of how wages and prices would behave in an ideal non-inflationary expansion. These are the guidelines. The new income produced by economic growth, they explained, would be distributed equally between labor and capital only if the national average rate of wage increases across the entire labor market kept pace with labor productivity. That's the wage guideline. Labor productivity nationally is a percentage increase each year, and that's going to be the ceiling of acceptable wage increases. And for the price guideline, prices were determined competitively in the marketplace so that productive firms passed on productivity increases to consumers in lower prices, rather than taking them as higher profits. Adherence to such standards by organized labor and business, it was thought, would hold the wage price spiral that had turned during the 1940s and the early 1950s. It would hold it in abeyance, stabilizing the labor and capital shares of a growing national income and holding the price level constant. As a general rule for approaching particular industries, the guide worked particularly well, surprisingly well for the period before the Vietnam War. The CEA guidelines coincided with a period of unusually low wage increases. Between 1961 and 1964, the unemployment rate fell from 6.9% to 5%. And in this period, the steelworkers, a million-person union in the early 60s, forewent a wage increase. The auto workers kept their wage increase to 2.5%, which was a percentage point below the wage guideline. According to the Department of Labor, collectively bargained wage increases across the economy were kept to 2.8% in 1961, 2.9% in 1962, 3% in 1963, and 3.2% in 1964. And the guideline in this period, the productivity guideline, is 3.2%. So wages are adhering to the voluntary guidepost, as they called it. These rates were well below the 3.9 to the 5.4% wage increases that unions had been winning during the late 1950s, which, by the way, was a period of high unemployment that the recently theorized Phillips curve predicted would have diminished wage demands, but which in fact did not. In keeping with both the president's general exhortation for wage restraint and the CEA's specific 3.2% guide, the CPI did not rise appreciably. Year-over-year increases for between 1962 and 1963 was 1.2%. And the next year, 63-64 was 1.3%, and in 64-65 it was 1.7%. So below 2% inflation for this early period, the first half of the decade. How did Kennedy keep wages in line? Well, after the 1960 election, the president appointed the lead attorney of the Steelworkers Union as the Secretary of Labor. In February, right after the inauguration, he issued an executive order forming an advisory committee for labor management policy, which was a 21-member group co-chaired by the Secretaries of Labor and Commerce, comprised of business and labor leaders. And this committee proved a staging ground for planning discussions. For example, in April 1962, after the steelworkers forewent a wage increase in loyalty to the White House, U.S. Steel Chairman Roger Blau met personally with the president to announce an across-the-board price increase in violation of the guideposts. Led by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, Goldberg and the CEA, Kennedy bitterly moved to coerce the nation's third largest corporation into rescinding the price increase. The morning after Blau's fait accompli, McNamara announced that the Department of Defense would not award procurement contracts to any steel company that followed U.S. Steel's price rise, and that it would make a new $5 million purchase of specialty steel to a firm, to the first firm that maintained price stability. 3 days later, on April 13, U.S. Steel rescinded its price increase. What were the reaction of the public to this high-profile conflict? Well, though stock traders briefly lost confidence, the public celebrated it. Quote, "Happy birthday, Mr. President," end quote, Marilyn Monroe sang in May of 1962, just weeks later. Quote, "For all the things you've done, the battles that you've won, the way you deal with U.S. Steel and our problems by the ton, we thank you so much," end quote. It's a famous, video recording. Over the next 2 years, the price index for durable goods actually fell. This was because of the tremendous productivity of these industries, which allowed for profits to rise even as prices fell, and is evident in their rates of return for the first half of the decade. If you look over this historical rates of return on equity, it's 13% in electrical machinery and 65, 17% in instruments and related products and 65. The auto industry actually lowered prices in 1966 in adherence to the guidelines, and they made a 19% return on equity, which was an increase over the 64, which had been 17%, so just tremendously profitable companies. Now, between the fall of 1965 and the fall of 1966, a rapid series of events dramatically thrust the White House guidelines into the center of national life. The decision that instigated the shift was President Johnson's July 1965 announcement that he was increasing the US troop presence in South Vietnam to defend the air bases that were used to launch bombing campaigns in North Vietnam. And the troop increase was accompanied by an increase in the draft and an acceleration of Defense Department orders, an acceleration of procurement that immediately rippled through the metals industry. Oh, okay. I have some quotes here from, McNamara and Steele. And during the first 6 months of 1966, during the military spending boom, the consumer price index began to rise at an annual rate of about 4%. And during this period, the White House continued the Kennedy administration's policy of asking organized workers to keep their wage demands within federal guidelines. So now that the price level is rising, these guidelines are increasingly perceived as being inequitable. So as the conservative economist Arthur Burns argued, quote, the condition cannot be expected to continue. Wages have been slow in adjusting to the higher cost of living, but that only means that adjustment is still ahead of us, end quote. Burns prophesied, quote, I fear we are on the threshold of a wage explosion, end quote. And during the contraction, when Burns's prophecy proved correct, the orthodox response of fiscal monetary contraction, which was applied in 66, 67, and again in 69, once Nixon comes into office, resulted in rising unemployment. But even as unemployment increased in this period, wages and prices continued to rise as well. So the reason for this is that the wage guideline that had been intended to withhold the increase in labor compensation was violated, and it was violated by organized labor for the reasons Burns prophesied, which is that it could not, a declining share of national income going to labor and in expansion could not be expected to last forever. So as an example of the weakest part of the plan there was workers' cooperation into to consenting to having their income reduced. In the paper, I go back over some of these examples of the fiscal monetary contraction, because that's often neglected in histories of the Vietnam War. And so if anyone's interested, I'd love to talk about that, but I am out of time, so I'd like to leave it there and thank everyone for their patience.
Perfect. Thanks, Andrew. Over to Tim.
Great, and I'll try to keep this really short so we have time for more discussion with everyone. So as I see it, Andrew's paper makes three important arguments. One is a kind of de-exceptionalizing argument that the US had its own form of indicative planning, and so there's less difference maybe than people sometimes suggest between the US and Western European economies. The second is that the limits of this US form of indicative planning were shown by the Vietnam War escalation and specifically its effects on the labor market. And the third is that the result of this failure of planning was a kind of anti-labor politics, which became a surrogate for the absence of planning. And I had just a couple of questions that maybe we can talk about later following on each of these points. First is to sort of press you, Andrew, on whether the US really had indicative planning or whether we should think of it more as an aspiration towards indicative planning that never fully came into fruition. Certainly the people in the Kennedy administration, like Tobin, were admirers of the French model, but I think if you ask them, they would say that they never quite were able to pull it off. So interested in your thoughts on that. Second is the question of historical contingency. Without the Vietnam War, would the guidelines have kept working, or would there have been a sort of, response to the growth of profitability on the part of labor that would have ultimately brought forth a similar response without the war? And finally, I'm curious, I know this is something you've written about in the longer version of this paper, how this all worked for workers who weren't members of unions. Even in the 1960s, less than a third of American workers were in labor unions. And so I'm curious how the guidelines and the tight labor markets would have affected those workers.
Terrific. Thanks, Tim. Now the turn is on me. So let me share my screen. Can you all see this? Okay, so this will be a very brief presentation on some of the key arguments in my book, How China Escaped Shock Therapy, the Market Reform Debate. In many ways, this is taking us back to the questions raised by Evan, but at the same time, all these questions of how planning could actually be pulled off in practice in the context of the market economy that Tim and Andrew have been developing in their presentations is also very relevant and in fact resonated with the debates amongst Chinese economists in the 1980s. So to start off, let me take you back to the late 1970s, when China was just at the verge of moving from late Maoism to reform. This raises the question of why was there such an urge for reform? I have conducted extensive oral history interviews for this project, and while my interviewees disagreed on most of the questions, they did agree on the question that in the late 1970s, reform was what they called a choice of no choice, or in other words, there were such severe material and economic pressures that necessitated a reorientation of the Chinese economic model. Of course, the revolution was always about much more than economic development, but already on the 2nd of October 1949, the editorial in the People's Daily stated on the ambition of the revolution that it was also to, quote, gradually change this backward agricultural country into a civilized and progressive industrial one, end of quote. Then in the late 1970s, Chen Yun, one of the key architects of economic reforms in China, along with Deng Xiaoping, in fact, in the early years, more decisive than Deng Xiaoping on economic questions, stated at the critical CCP Work Conference that it has been almost 30 years since the founding of the People's Republic of China, but there are still beggars. How can this be the case? If this problem of having enough to eat is not solved, the peasants might rise in rebellion and be led to the cities by local party leaders demanding food. So this very constellation resonates with the situation that Evan has recollected for us in the context of the 1920s in the Soviet Union. Of course, it was not quite as severe. Nevertheless, the debates in the Soviet Union around backstepping to lower levels of socialist organization in order to develop the forces of production in the first place, in order to then make space and create the necessary economic conditions for more advanced forms of socialism, very much resonated with China in the late 70s, and in fact was actively debated. In this broad context, Deng Xiaoping stated already in 1979, so 1 year into the reform period, quote, "It is wrong to maintain that a market economy exists only in a capitalist society, and that there's only a capitalist market economy. Why can't we develop a market economy under socialism?" But the key question debated throughout the 1980s amongst China's economists, involving a wide range of foreign advisors, was how to introduce market mechanisms into a command economy. So the key question was not whether or not to move towards more market in the context of the economic reform debate, but rather how to go about this task. The starting point for China's industrial urban economy was an economy that was very much organized based on the idea of one big national workshop. That is to say that prices in this context did not function as signals to individual decision makers in enterprises or consumers. In contrast, prices were shadow operations that were really means of accounting transactions that were planned by central command economies. More specifically, the prices of the most upstream, most essential producer goods were set, quote unquote, artificially low, whereas the prices of less essential downstream consumer goods were set, quote unquote, high, where these high prices for unnecessary consumer goods, think of as luxurious items as wristwatches, were high in order to be able to extract liquidity from households, whereas the low prices for heavy industry goods were meant to subsidize industrialization and the building up of intermediate goods sectors. In tackling the question of how to introduce market mechanisms into that kind of economy, two broad reform camps emerged. The first one, which I'm calling the dual track market reformers, very much emerged from the context of agricultural reforms, where the household responsibility system was the first breakthrough for economic reform, a policy that very much resonated with the Soviet tax in kind. The members of this group were young reform intellectuals who had spent their youth in the countryside during the Cultural Revolution and received backing by an older generation of leaders who had, for the most part, participated in the revolution and in the revolutionary struggles and the Civil War. They had an educational background and in being self-trained in Marxist classics, in Maoism, but then in the late 1970s and early 80s, engaged in a wide range of Western social science literatures, including important translation projects of classics of social science theory in the West. They drew their intellectual inspiration from empirical studies in China, Hungary, and Yugoslavia, as well as post-war Germany and the UK, and in fact also the US price control attempts and the transition from a war economy to a peace economy that has already figured in the previous presentations. They argued that China could pursue a dual track system where the second track, a market track, was already emerging at the margins of China's urban industrial economy as a result of the emergence of markets in the agricultural economy. So as peasants started to produce both for the plan and the market, they started to demand both producer goods and consumer goods, since they were also building up township and village enterprises, which created an endogenous dynamic towards a dual track system in the urban industrial economy. The question was then whether this dual track system that was emerging more or less spontaneously could be harnessed and systematized into a reform approach, or whether it would have to be suppressed and a more ideal type reform approach would have to be defined. This was in fact the stance of the so-called package price reformers, who were mainly composed of middle-aged established intellectuals and young academics, often with a background in the sciences. The middle-aged established intellectuals had received orthodox socialist training in Soviet economics and were the first to study modern economics in the United States and England in the 1980s. They drew their intellectual inspiration from the socialist calculation debate, Eastern European immigrant economists such as Burroughs, Schick, and Kornai, but also monetarists like Friedman, Chow, and German ordoliberals who were praising the Erhard Merkel. They argued that the dual track system would create friction and contradiction, and in fact, a more irrational kind of economic system than the pre-reform system, and must result in inherent rent seeking and corruption. So what China should do instead is to impose fiscal and monetary control and then liberalize all prices in one big bang. This is basically the first key step in the shock therapy script that later emerged in the context of transition from planned economies in Eastern Europe and Russia, and had also been tried in Chile. So here the idea is to replace market participation by the state with indirect macro control and let prices rule, where the most important element is to get prices right. In contrast, the dual track reformers critiqued this approach, arguing that a big bang would cause cost push inflation since supply was inelastic, so that liberalizing prices would simply lead to increases in prices in the upstream sectors, whereas these increases in prices would be handed down to the next production unit, eventually giving rise to a wage price spiral, where this wage price spiral would undermine the very conditions needed for economic reform rather than helping China to create an economy that could achieve more economic development. Furthermore, they argued that such a wage price spiral could not be contained by macroeconomic control, again resonating some of the arguments invoked by Tim and Andrew. So instead of a Big Bang, they suggested that China should keep control of the industrial core. The key difference between the two reform camps was not whether or not to liberalize the downstream inessential parts of the system, but whether or not the state should continue to plan the core of the industrial economy and participate in the market for essentials. In 1986, China came close to implementing a Big Bang. This was then halted as a result of the intervention of a delegation that was studying the Hungarian and Yugoslav experiences. In 1988, Deng Xiaoping himself took initiative towards a Big Bang. However, the announcement for price reform was sufficient to unleash such panic that China experienced the first period of relatively high inflation since the revolution, which then led to a reversal of that reform attempt. So in sum, we can contrast the logic of the Big Bang with the logic of the dual track system, where the logic of the Big Bang is to start from comparative statics, a stylized model of the old system, and a theoretically derived target model with reforms as a shock to transition. The target is to create complete markets, which is meant to be achieved by destroying the plan. In contrast, the logic of the dual track system is to start from an analysis of prevailing economic forces and institutions to identify ways to create reform dynamics at the margins and reindustrialize without undermining social stability. Market forces are here seen as a tool, as a means in a larger transformation process guided by the state. The first logic is in the tradition of the socialist calculation debate. The second logic, to some extent, is in the tradition of the new political economy. However, it operates with a very different kind of time horizon and it involved the possibility of giving up the target of a socialist planned economy and instead move to a socialist market economy. Thank you very much for your attention. The comments will now be presented by Evan. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm gonna, my comments are making some comparisons between the case of Chinese reforms and the Soviet case under the new economic policy. So first, I think there's a parallel between the two camps of package reform versus a more gradualist approach on the one hand, and the debate between Bukharin's peaceful economic class struggle and Preobrazhensky's primitive socialist accumulation on the other. I didn't have a chance to touch on that during my presentation, but essentially Preobrazhensky called for a more rapid pace of investment in heavy industry, arguing that the economic recovery from the war was reaching its limits since the recovery was largely due to the reabsorption of excess capacity that had gone idle, and therefore it was necessary to immediately start making large investments in new factories. And according to Preobrazhensky, the only way to procure the funds necessary for such a rapid pace of investment was to extract them from the peasant producers. But Bukharin accused Preobrazhensky of threatening the class alliance or bloc between the workers and peasants and called, as the more gradualist reformers did, for the NEP to grow into socialism and economic planning. Essentially, Bukharin, like the Chinese gradualist reformers, worried about the threats to social stability that would come from such a rapid pace of change. I know that even before the period of reforms, Mao had criticized the Soviet method of industrialization for essentially exploiting the peasantry, and the question of where to procure the funds for investment was a source of controversy. And there have actually been some scholarly comparisons between the Soviet Union and China that I found regarding these issues. On the ideological component of reforms, one key commonality is the idea of developing the forces of production at all costs. I quote a line from your book, from Isabella's book: "The argument that China was in a primary state of socialism and had to focus on the development of its forces of production became a kind of anything goes paradigm, wherein the most capitalist reforms could be legitimized as serving socialism." This is exactly the fundamental argument that the Bolsheviks made. However, there are some key differences. On the one hand, the Bolsheviks, Lenin, and even Bukharin viewed the NEP as a retreat While they viewed the NEP as immediately necessary, the labeling of the NEP as a retreat indicates that the policies of war communism were in fact in line with the long-term aspirations of Bolshevism, but that the forces of production simply were not ready for such a change in the relations of production. Thus, Lenin called for state capitalism to build the material conditions which would be necessary for economic planning. By contrast, from, say, the quote that you showed from Deng Xiaoping, it seems that at least some Chinese reformers viewed the reforms as a step forward, not backwards. They already endured more than 2 decades of a command economy, but as things were, the pace of economic development was simply too slow. Thus, it was not necessarily a matter of building the material conditions necessary to successfully implement economic planning. For example, Lenin's argument that state capitalism would build the capacity for public bookkeeping, accounting, and direct control, but those conditions already largely existed in the planning sector of the Chinese economy. And furthermore, the Bolsheviks viewed the use of markets and capitalist social relations as a temporary expedient separate from socialism and necessary to the transition towards planning, whereas ideologically, Chinese reformers incorporated markets and private property into its conception of socialism. Thus, we have the term socialist market economy and socialism with Chinese characteristics. And I'll end on just a question of ideologically within the Communist Party. I'm curious how markets and private property are, whether they're viewed as compatible with higher stages of socialism, which they envisioned would come in the future. That's all.
Terrific. Thanks, Evan. Okay, this leaves us 20 minutes of Q&A, which is just what we were aiming for. Terrific. So are there any questions from the audience at this point? If you have questions, feel free to either just turn on your microphone and ask your question, or post your question in the chat if you prefer, and I could read it out. Any questions from the audience? If there are no questions at this stage, I would hand it back to the panel and let everybody react to the comments that were presented to the papers. I go in reverse order this time. So I'll start with Andrew, Tim, Evan, and then place myself last. Andrew, would you like to react to Tim's questions, or also feel free to comment on any of the connections between the papers, or any thoughts that you might have on the other presentations? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess briefly, I could say something on each. Tim's questions about my paper, about whether it's appropriate to refer to US Cold War macro planning as indicative planning, is a good question. It's not one I know how to answer because it's not clear to me what rests on the label. Well, you know, I think it's true that what the United States was doing in the 60s was very similar functionally to what France was doing. Just, you know, holding meetings with businessmen and negotiating prices with them is, you know, whether we call that indicative planning, I don't know. But I think it is a distinct and deserves some name. A general, well, you mentioned, second specific question, what about workers who are not in unions, the non-union sector during the inflation? And I think that's a very good point to bring up, and I think it was a source of tension between the political bloc that had brought the New Deal order into existence. But during the 1960s, you get government economic advisors telling organized workers to restrain their wage increases to enable the unorganized workers to earn more. And of course, during the 60s, there's a whole gendered and racial aspect to this of women of color in the service sector experiencing above guidepost wage increases that the Kennedy and Johnson people thought was a great thing, but caused all these intense political conflicts with the white male, what might have been white ethnic construction workers and factory workers, and these people who see no reason to have to be the ones who eat the cost of inflation for the sake of these unorganized workers, and there's all sorts of racist reasoning behind that. But anyway, so that's a great question. Now, just for the panel as a whole, one theme that came out of it, and I think it's very intriguing, is the role price policy in the capital goods sector plays sort of at the core, at the heart of the growth process. And now, it's certainly a theme in each of the papers. I guess as we think about it, it would be interesting to think about, to sort of understand what exactly that role price policy in the capital goods sector plays, because it's very intriguing to me. All right. Thanks, Isabella.
Terrific. Thanks, Andrew. Let's move on to Tim.
Thanks, and thanks, Andrew, for your comments. I pulled out two main questions you were asking me. The first one was, what's new about the perspective I was trying to reconstruct, given that mainstream macroeconomic practice has been and continues to be reliant on interest rate hikes, the effect of which is to slow investment, right? And so you're asking, isn't it sort of already taken for granted that excessive investment can be at fault in inflationary episodes, which I think is a good question. I've been very struck when I look specifically at the late 1970s, that the Carter administration, at the same time that they've already embraced, after November 1978, and especially after August 1979, they've embraced calls for monetary tightening. They still wish to see an increase in the investment share of GDP. And you could maybe conclude that there's something incoherent about that, but they were committed to both of those things. They wanted a general slowdown, but that would come primarily out of consumption, so that it would be consistent with, a further rise in the share of investment, which at that time was already at record levels. So at least at that moment, I think that there was a desire to have it both ways. It would be interesting to look, and I haven't looked in detail, at the late 1990s, when there's also a kind of classic investment boom, which again, led to an investment overhang, and you'll see it described that way in Federal Reserve newsletters and stuff. I haven't looked at sort of how they thought about that in relation to monetary tightening, but it would be interesting to see whether that was different in the late 90s than it had been in the late 1970s. The second question you asked was, if this diagnosis was there, why wasn't it acted on? And just to keep this brief, I think it's very common for there to be intellectual recognition of something, but for the sort of political, prerequisites of a shift to be missing. And I think we see that clearly in China today. If the English language reports are to be believed, there's widespread awareness in China at the highest levels that there's something very unsustainable about their own version of the investment-led growth model. And yet, despite sort of periodic calls for rebalancing toward consumption, there seems to be some obstacle towards doing that. And obviously the obstacles in today's People's Republic of China are different in some ways than they were in the US, but I think probably you could start to think about those in similar terms.
Yeah, that's a great point. Evan, over to you.
Yeah, I don't have much. I mean, I thought all the presentations are really fascinating. I mean, one simple question for Tim is that I was not familiar with these periods of the coincidence of unemployment and inflation in the 1950s and 1960s, and I'm curious why you think it is that in any, say, like introductory economics course, or I'm not familiar. I don't know if most economists are familiar, but like, is there any kind of political or ideological reason why this period has kind of just been forgotten? I think the point that price policy in the capital goods sectors is a common theme is really a really good observation. In the Soviet Union and China, obviously there's extremely different dynamics because these are sort of at least in the early period of the Soviet Union and early before reform period of China, these were undeveloped nations with large agricultural large peasant populations, and there were, in both the Soviet Union and China, there were these problems of what's called price scissors, whereby the state was trying to rapidly encourage investment, and so they were keeping prices for capital goods high and agricultural prices were low. which led in both cases of the Soviet Union and China in certain time periods for peasant producers to simply stop producing and selling to the market because agricultural prices were so low. And I think it's interesting that in the case of the capitalist economies, or at least in post-war United States, it's not exactly parallel, but high capital prices leading to inflation coming from state-led demand for armaments industries. I think that's an interesting parallel there. Yeah, I'll leave my comments at that.
Great, thank you. Let me just also say that I really enjoyed this panel, and that I think there's so many fascinating connections that allow us to kind of dig between the surface of Cold War dichotomies of opposition of capitalist and socialist economies. I'd like to ask a somewhat provocative question to Tim and Andrew, which connects to the discussions in the socialist context, where it's always about the compatibility of markets with socialism. Was there any such discussion in the capitalist context around the compatibility of planning with capitalism? And what about this ideological level? I think it's been great how you have unpacked these discourses on this operational, hands-on economic policy, technocratic kind of level, but how does this link back to this big ideological question? Relatedly, I would be interested to hear any thoughts that you might have on the implications of your account for the history that we tell about macroeconomics. What follows from your accounts for the historiography of macroeconomics in the 20th century? I realize it's a very big question, but still, if you have any thoughts to share. And then finally, the question of really to all three of you, is that, I mean, we currently are in another moment of transition. I mean, in so many ways, but most obviously transition to a green economy, which seems to be an absolutely urgent matter at this point. So are there any implications from the various transitions that you have studied for the transition, for thinking about a transition to greening the economy? Finally, for Evan, you have alluded to the NPE debate resonating with various debates in, for example, the Cuban context. And I was just wondering if you have any thoughts on, I thought you did brilliantly in comparing the NPE with the Chinese debate. If you had any thoughts on how this resonated with some of these other contexts that you have looked at. Okay, then let's do the reverse order now, and feel free to include any final comments that you might have. So let's start with Evan this time.
So, I mean, just responding to the last question, there is a paper, I forget the name of the author, but someone did a really interesting connection between the way that different reformers have interpreted the NEP. And so he looked at reformers in the 1960s in the Soviet Union, 1980s in the Soviet Union, Eastern European, in Hungary and Czechoslovakia. And each of these, each of the reform movement, the economists involved advocating for reforms, took their own interpretation of the new economic policy and trying to keep in line with sort of Marxist-Leninist ideology, tried to extract quotes from Lenin and Bukharin, et cetera, interpreting the new economic policy as, see, like this socialism is compatible with markets, depending on the different sort of goals of each different market reformer. I can't speak to that in too much detail because I'm not too familiar, but there have been some studies explaining the different interpretations, which I think is interesting. I had something else to say, but
anything on the question of transitions? Not to put you on the spot, but just if you had any thoughts you wanted to share.
Oh yeah, I was well, about today's moment in climate change as well. I mean, I think the topic of economic planning is sort of back on the table. But there's this, I mean, the word planning itself, Andrew used, well, the term indicative planning is obviously very different from planning in the sense of removing the market mechanism in place of, say, the direct allocation of resources. That's quite different from the state having a plan trying to influence economic outcomes via, industrial policy, or even trying to have some kind of bargain, some set bargain between wages and employers. Those are two sort of different types of planning, but nonetheless, I mean, obviously, free market, libertarian ideology and neoliberal ideology of saying no intervention at all in the state. I mean, obviously, I think, given the response both to the 2008 crisis and the COVID responses, I mean, obviously that logic is seemingly coming to an end or changing in some way. But I'm curious about if there is some kind of serious, like let's say in 10 years, there's some kind of huge heat wave that kills, 30 million people or something. If the need to directly do away with market mechanism, I think we might be approaching some kind of moment where that could be back on the table.
Great, thank you, Evan. Then we have Andrew, right? No, sorry, Tim.
Yeah. So on the question of planning and ideology, there's actually there's a great moment just before the Korean War in the congressional hearings on the economic report of the president, where a Republican congressman pulls out a table from the economic report, which has these, sort of literally like 5-year projections for where they want investment and consumption to be, and says like, isn't this a 5-year plan? And Keyserling says, no, it's not a 5-year plan. And they have this incredible back and forth about the extent to which this 5-year plan can be considered a 5-year plan. And Keyserling himself had actually been a socialist and the subject of many FBI loyalty investigations. So he was, especially like careful about this. And then what's interesting is then a few months later, the Korean War comes, and of course, like no one can really object to like planning in wartime, but they do object to making it permanent. And so that's why you see, even though business does get on board with the Korean War rearmament, by 1952, they're very eager for the war to end and support Eisenhower basically on that basis. I think that's relevant to the green transition question because, the history is just so clear that when there is a compelling enough emergency, these things get put to one side. But the history also shows that attempts to make the leap from we did this in wartime to we can do this for another reason also almost always fail. And so the question, which is like hugely important for our future, is climate change enough like an actual war that this will happen? Because we know that just attempting to say we should do something like a war has almost never worked. I think I can tie together, Isabella, your question about historiography with Evan's question about why people haven't remembered these proto-stagflation things. Because I think the point for the historiography is that I think people think that Keynesianism was just kind of befuddled in the 1970s, and was a paradigm that couldn't deal with these anomalies. But we actually know when we look at the historical evidence that they had all kinds of complicated structural, accounts for inflation. They didn't just think it couldn't happen at the same time as unemployment. And so that's the historiographical point, which then that raises Evan's point as a follow-up. So, okay, so why has that been forgotten? The innocent explanation is that the proto-stagflations were just not as bad as the ones that came later. When you look at the inflation everyone was so concerned about in the late 1950s, now it looks tiny. The less innocent explanation is, I think, both sides of the political spectrum have a interest in stressing the 1970s as a rupture. On the right, there's a desire to blame it on the growth of the welfare state, which really hardly existed before the late 60s and 70s, when 70% of the federal budget was military spending. But for liberals and maybe left liberals too, there's an interest in blaming it on exogenous events, like the oil and food price shocks, which then sort of make it easier to treat as an accident rather than something that says something about the structure of mid-century capitalism, which people on the liberal left have now attempted to defend in light of what came later.
Great, thank you, Tim. Andrew?
Sure, I have a brief quote I'd like to read on the question of ideology. You heard me read Marilyn Monroe's celebration of President Kennedy. 3 years later, once the Vietnam War began, Robert McNamara had Roger Blau on the phone trying to dissuade him from raising prices. And afterwards he called President Johnson. And so this is the quote here. "It's like dealing with a Neanderthal man, Mr. President. Business thinks government is moving to destroy the market economy. And he, Roger Blau, just couldn't act in a way that led his business colleagues and associates to feel he supported the government in moving to establish wages and prices other than through the private economy. He's not interested to go back to his country club and be called a slave of the government, end quote. So like, that's the conversations they're having over this, you know, and ultimately why, you know, the voluntary controls program completely fell apart, because in the crunch, you know, without the power of law or anything, this kind of cooperation with the military, you know, expansion was only going to go so far. Now, there's two other questions. Briefly, implications for the historiography. I mean, for my project, it's to show that macroeconomics, what we think of as macroeconomics, the indirect control of the economy through fiscal monetary policy, is a Cold War construct, and you know, it was an intellectual and ideological project that failed in the 1970s and earlier. And it's, you know, unique and had served a certain purpose during the Cold War, when large corporation executives feared the government would take over their companies. So yeah, it's pretty, you know, the implication for historiography is sort of to provincialize macroeconomics in time. Now, as far as the last question about transition, Schumpeter has this line in his, you know, Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy: inflation comes through the payroll. And the idea there is that, you know, you can have rising prices, rising profits, and, you know, you can depress workers' income, but it's when workers begin to expand payroll, you know, they want to defend their real income or something, that you really get into an inflation. Inflation comes through the payroll. And in my history, you know, the history I've done, written of the wage and price controls, in controlled periods, you end up with wage compression. And this is a way to sort of moderate the growth in payrolls. So if there's any kind of recommendations, you know, it's that compression should be a goal. You know, we should when we're thinking about what to do with the labor share of income, you know, we should try to compress wages, because when wages go up, there are going to be employers who raise prices, you know, at least unless we get some kind of very effective price control bureaucracy, which doesn't seem in the cards anytime soon. But anyway, has a whole ideological component of encouraging people to think of each other as equals, and, you know, so yeah, 3 questions, 3 answers. Great questions. Thanks, Isabella.
Terrific. Thanks so much. I'll just leave it at that, and really thank you all. And I hope we can continue this conversation and explore the various connections. I think it's obvious that there is a lot of connections and a lot of unexpected perspectives that lead us to rethink some of the most basic assumptions we have about capitalism, socialism, the market, prices, and some of these big questions. Thank you very much for joining us. I'll stop the recording, but if anyone would still like to chat informally, we can do that.